All right, so what we're doing here is we're doing Latinos in the Gilded Age. So with the Gilded Age, right, you cover the different forms of historiography, covering that. You have somewhat court history, where you contend that we created fertile soil for the Second Industrial Revolution to erupt. And I had a section on that, but I didn't find it incredibly relevant to the Latino experience, so I didn't put it in this one, I don't believe. But in my regular US history class, I have it. And in it, right, it shows evidence of just, starting with Hamilton's program of subsidizing industries to try to make us self-sufficient and diversify. If someone's doing something that engages in improvements for the entire commercial economy, then the government will help you pay for the costs, right? Bond certificates, people lending money to the government, being promised interest back along with the loan. By the Civil War, we had 500 million of European investments into the economy, and that's only going to climb during the late 1800s. And you have just the standard of living is going to change, and of course, to a lot of people, improve. And I'm not talking about necessarily disposable income, although that supposedly climbed a bit, but just as far as consumerism, the opportunity to buy consumer mass-produced products, people living in cities and all the amenities that were offered in cities with entertainment, employment, etc. You're going to find that during the Gilded Age. But then on the negative side, right? And then not to mention, you're going to have, people kind of rationalize the economy, rationalize different industries like Rockefeller with oil and Carnegie with steel. But on the downside, right? Gilded Age implies that something has had a superficial job and looks glittery and impressive on the outside, but you scratch the surface and you find little to anything underneath that surface. So at any rate, you find corruption during the Gilded Age. You had political bosses and political machines that basically bought the votes of immigrants by offering them places to stay, offering them employment, offering them medical help for their children, what have you, at the local to state level. Of course, Boss Tweed of infamous fame is going to actually be arrested for his irregularities and what he did politically and so forth. But it'll be a while before they're kind of caught and made villains in the public eye. And so they get away with what they did for quite some time during the Gilded Age. Also, right, you have mergers. And a merger is kind of a euphemism for saying pass away for someone who dies. Right, it's a nicer way of saying describing an ugly reality. With Gilded Age, you have people that like Rockefeller. He'd come in and he will have done his work, and he would tell someone, "So I see that you made about 300,000 last year in your oil company. All right, good for you. What if I told you that I made so many million last year, and I give you 8% stock in my company of dividends of shares, and in return, you lift this headache of a job off your shoulders and hand it to me. I believe you have subterranean oil that your machinery is unable to extract anyway. I'll take that headache from you. I'll give you 8% share, and you'll make easily 300,000 a year doing nothing." And so some people took that offer. But when you didn't, that's when things got ugly. He was a major shareholder in all the major railroads that connected the crude oil to the refineries. Also, I'm sure, I don't recall, but I'm sure he bought a majority share in the major shipping companies that had the shipping avenues between those two as well. So he can get rebates off of them. But at any rate, he could tell them, "I'll just refuse service to you." He had ways of extorting them, and he did. And so he would take over, the entire industry. He supposedly 90% of the oil that was extracted and refined and sold was in the hands of Rockefeller alone, of the entire country. And so Carnegie, he got lucky with the little Bessemer ovens to convert iron into steel. Had some Scottish and English laborers who really knew what they were doing and set the tone for a very intelligent way, a very effective and efficient and cost efficient way of producing steel. And he was able to undersell a lot of his competitors. And then when he couldn't compete with them, or he didn't like competing with them because they put their prices, artificially low in price bid wars, he would team up with them and say, okay, you have this region, I'll have this region, where the sales go to me, and that region, the sales go to you. And that wasn't illegal at the time. And so they would team up and do stuff like that. Rockefeller as well would promise like 6 tons a week of oil to a certain railroad company. And he would team up his oil with other big competitors so that they could meet that 6 ton requirement. And then in return for being able to charge per pound and getting money like that from 6 tons a week, the railroads would promise rebates, right, or reductions in cost for these robber barons, as they were called by their enemies and their critics. So at any rate, you have that. The gap between the rich and the poor was exacerbated. It was made worse. Howard Zinn has a take on it. I have it in the next handout, where it was like 1%, the top 1% of the population owned over 50% of the property in wealth and assets and property. Okay. And so there were definitely problems. We became number one or number two in industrial accidents in the world. Because after all, right, to put in safety protocols, that costs time and it costs money. And they didn't want to do that. So it was largely out of greed that they would keep things quite dangerous. All right. And so the mom and pop shops were kind of gobbled up in the smaller competitors. The workers were largely exploited. And when they tried to unionize and fight back, they didn't have much luck. You look at the railroad strike of 1877, that was very impressive, but eventually kind of squashed. You look at the Homestead Act, or the Homestead Strike, I'm sorry, of 1892, and that was shut down. And the 1894 Pullman Strike was shut down as well. And so when you look into those, they're quite dramatic. And I'm not going to take the time now in a Latinos in U.S. history class to describe them in detail. I'll spare you that. But they were quite dramatic, and the workers lost. Okay. Although I will make the caveat, the exception, I don't recall who won in the 1877 railroad strike, but I know in the two in the 1890s they lost. All right. So you have the trust somewhat. You have a exploitation of the proletariat, of the manual laborers, their weakness in unionizing and striking, growing gap between the rich and the poor, centralization of industries. So Cyrus McCormick took over farm equipment. Carnegie took over steel. Rockefeller took over oil. Duke took over tobacco, and the list goes on and on. Okay. So at any rate, going on to the assignment. I go to 3 states in succession. I go to Arizona, then New Mexico, and then California. And I show how the narrative of conflict history, looking at winners and losers and trying to elicit your empathy for those who lost, it seems to be the most appropriate historical narrative for this topic. The Mexican Americans, of course, were somewhat put at the bottom. They were kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat. That is the manual laboring class of the industrial era or economy. There weren't a lot of opportunities for advancement. They didn't have actual laws that I know of against advancement at the workplace. They just didn't do it. Okay, they just didn't do it. And then the Latino owners, those engaging in commercial enterprises amongst the Latinos, especially, while it grew, in Arizona. It did not for Latinos. All right. So the smaller copper competitors were gobbled up. The three C's, cattle, copper, and cotton, kind of prevailed, and the Latinos did not really control any of those three major industries. It was mainly kind of Anglo-American corporations that did. All right, so that was Arizona, and then in New Mexico, add to that story is added to it is corruption. See here, the Santa Fe ring, they rigged elections, they chose provisional governors and judges that were in their pockets, and they manipulated the law in their favor. All right. They would engage in secret cattle rustling, where they would hire people to steal other people's cattle. They would put in dummy entries into the West with corporation employees' names, etc., to gain more and more bids on land in cases in which land was given out. And there were a few cases in California, and there were definitely cases in Nebraska with the Homestead Act of 1862, where they grant 160 acres virtually for free if you stayed on it for 10 years, cultivated it, swore allegiance to the Union because they're in the midst of the Civil War, and not bring slaves with you. But the the Latinos, right? This is interesting. At one case, they're going to be entitled as white Hispanics, right? Remember, the term Hispanic is just referring to their Spanish heritage. But in this case here in 1857, it hadn't happened yet. And so in the People versus Aaliyah, they couldn't even give testimony in court because of their alleged indigenous blood, because they were mestizo people. All right. So they rigged business contracts. They did it all. Racism kept the Anglo inhabitants of the cities from teaming up, or I'm sorry, the Latino employers from teaming up with their Latino counterparts. All right. California, they developed all these industries: lumber milling, boot making, textile production, mining, vegetable and fruit canneries, breweries, wineries, distilleries, lock and clock factories, machine tool production, right? But the Latinos did not control any of it. A lot of them lived in segregated slum districts, or barrios, as they're still called. Okay. So barred from business and employment opportunities, states' rights, excluded from or segregated in schools, churches, and other majority-dominated institutions, and politically neutralized by gerrymandering and stringent or strict voting requirements, minorities remained isolated from the mainstream, he says. Okay. And gerrymandering, right? What they would do is they'd find an area where the Latinos were over 50% of the population, and they'd split them up into at least groups of at least 2, 3, or more groups, and put them with nearby Anglos to artificially ensure that they constituted the minority instead of the majority of any voting districts. Okay, very manipulative, discriminatory practice. So they largely remained economically deprived. And then you had the great orphan abduction to show socially, in the realm of culture and socially, that Latinos were discriminated against. All right. So you have that. And then you have imperialism. The idea here, right, is that they are, the United States can't deny that we took over Puerto Rico, Guam, for the time being, the Philippines, etc., and for 4 years, Cuba. Instead, right, we try to contend that we felt like we had to because the beliefs and the events that were happening at that time. So you had your people like Malthus, who thought an end of the world struggle was coming because the population was growing exponentially, and it was going to outstrip the availability of resources like water and oil, etc. So therefore, right, there'd be like an apocalyptic fight over these scarce resources. And Chamberlain and Gobineau wrote that different races and nations and civilizations were going to fight it out. We're going to duke it out. So social Darwinism, right? The idea of survival of the fittest, and that civilizations already have an ethnic makeup that helps determine how they're going to respond to progressive changes and ideas, and then their culture as well and of course their leaders are going to determine if they embrace novelty or not, and those who do not are going to die out. Okay, so they don't get into like random mutations and stuff like that of Darwinism, but they put it to a societal level and make it about choice, right? That you either change with the times or you don't. Friedrich Nietzsche said that man was getting too soft and that he needed to go back to his primal roots. He thought one particular problem was the slave morality that he saw in Christianity, blessing the weak and the meek and the humble and the sickly, etc. And he wanted more of a Roman or Germanic, you know, more filled with vitality and aggression, etc. Whether it was true or not, whether it was kind of polluted or not, the Nazi regime is going to thank Nietzsche for some of his ideas. All right. So kind of dangerous ideas when you take them to their conclusion. Alfred Thayer Mahan said America needs to engage in geopolitics. We need to put America first. We need to look at the map as like a chessboard and deal with contingencies, deal with those who may face us as our greatest enemies. And in doing so, we need to preemptively, before the fight begins, take over vital spots on the globe for our naval ships to be stored there, for our access to coal to use for the steam engines for the ships, and other resources, right? And the idea is on those pivotal spots that you look at the globe, and oftentimes they happen to be island countries in our backyard in the Pacific and in our front porch in the Caribbean. You say you don't take no for an answer with these small countries. If they're not willing to compromise and engage in quid pro quo, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, then you force yourself upon them because you have to be ready for that enemy. And of course, we were primarily scared of Germany and England. All right. And then some people try to turn it into a good thing and say, well, if those backward peoples are doomed for extinction anyway, they'd actually be better off being colonized by the US because we'll bring things that are progressive and modern to them. We'll bring political liberties and economic opportunities, kind of manifest destiny rewrapped. We're going to make them better off, right? And so they call it the white man's burden to take care of these primitive people and to catch them up to speed. And of course, it was under an assumption, right, that you could help yourself as the colonizer as well in quid pro quo fashion, and do things for your economy as far as dumping some of your excess products into their markets, and also storing your navy there and ensuring that you have coaling stations for your ships, etc. And so this is a pretty strong statement. Yellow journalism was taking things out of context, exaggerating, or sometimes outright lying in journalism to try to elicit a certain predetermined response. Whether you wanted your people to go to war, etc., you tried to hit emotional buttons within them, and they supposedly did so successfully. According to Stephen Kinzer, he says, yellow journalism brought about the most profound reversal of public opinion in the history of American foreign policy. That's a strong statement. So he's saying, right, that the yellow journalist, when Cuba tried in the 1870s to break free from Spain and it didn't work, and they tried again in 1895. And this time around, yellow journalism is going to make villains of the Spaniards. In particular, a guy named Valeriano Weyler, the butcher, as they called him in the press, because of his tendency to put the native Cubans in concentration camps and how poorly things worked out for them in doing such. But however, right, we're going to contend that we're going to bring good things to Cuba, to the Philippines, and to Puerto Rico that were all under Spain still and fighting for their independence, and they would be better off for it. All right, so that's court history. And then in addition to that, right, for supportive data of things that we're going to bring to these islands, I want to say that we're going to cover it in the future, but just in case, education. Okay, the famous Thomasites on the USS Thomas came into the Philippines and they established a public school system for the Filipino people. They had health and sanitation brigades to separate sewage and running water and give vaccines to the people. And yes, it did help with mortality rates. They're going to bring a tutelage oriented political system whereby it's somewhat representative, whereby the Filipinos and the people of their islands can vote for some people in office amongst their own, but they are sharing power with Americans who have veto power, let's face it, over them. All right. And what we're saying, right, is that just like a child needs to grow up slowly into a man, they have to become prepared for self-government. They're not ready for it yet. Okay. And he said, even though well-to-do, the ilustrados, as they were called, the educated Filipinos, he said they were so used to a corrupt Spanish system, whereby they didn't put first what was best for the entire public well-being, civic virtue, that they were not accustomed to that, that even they needed to be taught, right, and acclimated to a more liberty-loving Republican type of government. And I don't mean the Republican Party. I mean a republic like Rome's and like ours. All right. So at any rate, they, for instance, right, they had the assembly in the Philippines and they elected their own Filipinos there. But then there was a National Council of Americans who had veto power over the assembly. You had one governor. Taft was the initial governor, I believe, and Taft is the same Taft that will become president in about 15 years or 14 years. But at any rate, yeah, we kept control over them, but we gave them some representative government for the time being. All right. And this is also the era of the progressive movement in the 1890s. And with the progressives, they were very kind of paternalistic in some ways. That those who were educated in the proper fields of political science, economics, etc., should be in key pivotal positions to make pivotal decisions according to the laws of economics, the laws of political science, etc., because they believed that there were, almost mathematical type laws that everything abides by or is supposed to abide by. All right. They did allow parties, like in the Philippines, that were against us, like the National Party, the Nacionalista Party. They were heavily voted into office. We did allow free press. They had like the newspaper El Renacimiento, the Rebirth, and La Voz de Mindanao, El Ideal, La Vanguardia, etc. And so we did tolerate a hostile press, but still, we kept Americans in charge until we left. And we're not going to leave, you guys, until the end of World War II. We got rid of some of the archaic things that the Spanish had, the cedula tax, the public works system called the repartimiento that we've covered. We got rid of those things. The Catholic Church's power over education and over lending, we kind of ended their domination in both those areas. So, very strong Catholics did not like that, but a lot of people who claim to be progressive and looking forward to future modern changes did. Okay. So at any rate, yeah. And look at the paternalism here. A caricature of American paternalistic designs to uplift and civilize backward peoples. So if you see this, right, that says Cuba, he represents Puerto Rico. Is that Samoa? No, My eyesight is deteriorating. I apologize. If you look closer, you could find out what island nations those two represent. And look at the Native American over here, reading his book, almost as if he's in trouble. And then what do you know? We have someone else coming. And when you have that Q, that curly Q in the back of the hair, it makes you think it's definitely an East Asian, like a Chinese person. Number two, right, is we're going to contend that we had two presidents in a row that were hesitant to get involved in the Spanish-American War against Spain to help out, ostensibly, to help out the Cubans, right? So you had Cuban rebel leaders at El Galeon who decided that they were going to set fire to dual citizens' property to try to get the Americans to get involved legally in the issue. You had juntas or committees that were formed not only in Cuba, but also in Florida and in New York amongst Cuban Americans. And they tried to elicit financial help toward the cause of a free Cuba, Cuba Libre, and also try to get mercenaries to come and fight, especially Cuban immigrants and those with dual citizenship of American citizenship and Cuban. All right. And yellow journalism is going to take off as well. Oops. All right. And then look at what Kristen Hoganson says. She says there was a spirit of the age in the 1890s, and it was filled with machismo, right? Because you remember you have Nietzsche, you have social Darwinism with Huxley and Spencer. And so it was in your best interest if you wanted to be elected as an American politician, she says, to appear manly, to be aggressive, to show strength, etc. And that is not what was conveyed about President McKinley. It's one of many ironies about him. So the De Lome letter was from one Spanish diplomat to another, and he tells the other Spanish diplomat, "Don't worry, I don't think the U.S. will get involved to fight us and help the Cubans out because the president doesn't seem to have much of a backbone." Well, that's going to be confiscated by an English dignitary, and he's going to give it to our press, and they're going to run with it, saying that our president has been called a coward by the Spaniards. All right. Then the next step to trying to pressure the president was American money that was being lost in Cuba, not only by dual nationals and Americans who owned land and became big sugar planters on the island of Cuba, and they were having their stuff put to fire and so forth with guerrilla warfare that was going on the island. But also, right, you have the contention that our trade, we couldn't trade well because they had so much upheaval at this time, and because the Spaniards were trying to blockade the Cubans and try to starve them into submission. All right. So look at what Senator Chandler says. He says, "We will declare war in spite of him," right? As if we're gonna go to war even if our president doesn't want to. And then you have the USS Maine. There was a well-known bullfighter who had a bullfight in Havana, Cuba, and people from all over the world came to watch. And so Cuban rebels took advantage of it, you know, kind of like Tibetans arguing their cause when China hosted the Olympics to let people know, hey, you have a people here who are mistreated. The Cubans did just that, and the Spaniards cracked down on them physically and violently there in Havana, and some of them were dual citizens. So the president supposedly thought, okay, hesitantly, we need to do at least a show of force to the Spaniards to let them know we're watching what they're up to, and we're especially watching over the dual nationals who have American citizenship. Because remember, it was arguable, according to the 5th and 14th Amendments, American government is to protect our life, liberty, and our property. And that, you know, if that entails overseas, it's up to each administration to decide that. So the Maine is there to intimidate the Spanish as a naval frigate, and it blows up after about a month, and it kills about 250 Americans. And even so, the president says, "I do not propose to be swept off my feet." He still wouldn't go to war. So finally, what he does is he says, all right, I need money to build up the armed forces because it looks like it's happening. It's going to happen almost inevitably. And he sends an ultimatum to Spain. He says, you have a certain number of days. I want to say it was a little over a month. It wasn't long at all. You have a certain number of days to either squash this rebellion or come to terms with the Cuban rebels. All right. And if you don't within that time frame, the U.S. is going to intervene and help the Cubans out. So they didn't meet the time frame. They didn't meet the time frame, and so that's officially the reason why we went to war, is them not complying with the ultimatum. So the president, right, is going to be shot by a Polish immigrant anarchist, Leon Kolgutz, and but not before he gets us involved in this war. All right. So he asks Congress. Congress complies, but with the ultimatum, right? He knew that a liberal regime had taken over in Spain under Prohedis Sagasta. He knew that they offered them limited autonomy, kind of like Canada under Great Britain to this day. A lot of local autonomy, a lot of national autonomy, but their armed forces and their foreign policy would continue to be run by Spain. That was their idea of a compromise. Get this, in Puerto Rico, they accepted this compromise. The Puerto Ricans accepted this compromise. But in the Philippines and in Cuba, they did not. And there was good reason for the president to know that this was not an attainable ultimatum. If they've been fighting since 1895, who was to think that they could end this war militarily within a month or two, right? And then secondly, if the island rebels of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, if they were willing to agree to nothing less than absolute 100% independence, then what made the president think that they would come to terms with each other in agreement? Because under Spain, right, them giving them limited autonomy was as good as they could get, was as good as they could offer, because it was a matter of national prestige back in Spain. You can't just give your island colonies away and expect to win in your re-election bid. So at any rate, some people think that the president, McKinley, knew exactly what he was doing and gave them an ultimatum that he knew they could not meet, that is Spain, because there was some side of him that almost wanted to go to war. So then when we go to war, right, he expands it. He expands the war and he sends the Navy to the Philippines. Remember, the Filipino people, under an organization named Katipunan, and under a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo, they never asked for our help. They never asked for our help. But we're going there ostensibly to help them, liberate them from the Spanish. So we had a battle in Manila, a naval battle that was very one-sided. And because we contended, right, that we needed to defeat the Spanish Navy there. All right. But then after that, we sent foot soldiers into the main islands of the archipelago of the Philippines. So what is it, like Mindanao, Luzon? At any rate, I used to know them. So we send troops into those islands and we're fighting, and we don't even collaborate with the Katipunan, with the Organization for Independence of the Filipinos. All right. So we're acting very arrogantly toward them, dismissive of them, and we're not even there to help out, to show that there's any remote altruistic, motives of ours, that we truly are concerned about the Filipino people and want to help liberate them, etc. As a matter of fact, when Manila is turned over to us, the Spanish turned it over to the Americans, and the Americans put up an American flag instead of the Katipunan flag of the Filipino people wanting their own republic. And then, of course, at the end of the war, they met in a place called Malolos. And at Malolos, they established a written constitution that, guess what? It was a constitutional federal republic, just like the U.S. And our leaders said, don't be silly, Filipinos. You're not ready for self-government. You're not ready for a government like ours. So we denied them the opportunity to create their own government, their own new sovereign nation. We stayed there at the end. We accepted the defeat of the Spanish. We put up the American flag, and they realized at that point that we're there to stay. So almost immediately, they fought against us, and we had like a Vietnam-like experience in the Philippines, okay, in the year 1900. And so it was there were a lot of alleged cases of violations of Geneva Convention standards, a lot of killing of prisoners of war, and not taking prisoners. We called them a pejorative term, gogos. I have no idea the origin of that term, but we called the Filipinos gogos, and it was not good. It was not, it was very disdainful. Um, and so we're going to end up capturing Emilio Aguinaldo. We tricked him. He was a member of the Tagalog tribe, and the Macabebe. We paid the Macabebe leaders to come and offer a truce with the Tagalog and join forces against the Americans. But it was a trap, and Aguinaldo was trapped and made a political prisoner by us. So then the next thing we ironically, or we tried to do is we tried to arguably win over the Ilustrados. Remember, the Ilustrados were the privileged Filipinos who had some education and were part of like the white collar middle class Filipino society. And so often, as you could guess, right, a lot of them had Spanish fathers and Malaysian Filipino mothers. So at any rate, with those types of leaders, right, we offered them opportunities to share in government. So, like for instance, at the provincial level, there were to be they would put like in a kind of equivalent of a county, you'd have an elected Filipino leader, and then he would have two Americans to jointly rule with him. So what do you know? We outnumber him 2-1. Then at the national level, they had, as I mentioned, an elected assembly, which was the lower house of the legislature, and they were elected by Filipinos, and they elected fellow Filipinos. But the upper house, right, the council was able to veto their decisions. And then we had a handpicked governor who could veto both. So, like I said, it was under the guise of tutelage that these people were not ready yet for self-government, and we're going to allow them to share somewhat in government responsibility until they're ready. All right. And remember, they won't be considered ready until 1946 at the end of World War II. So at any rate, in doing that, right, with the Filipino people, we also brought, like I said, the people on the USS Thomas. They came in and established a public school system. We did the sanitation and health program with vaccines, separating sewage and running water. We brought in electricity. And so we brought in these amenities, right, under the guise of the white man's burden, right, that we're helping out the less fortunate, that they're just going to become extinct anyway in this social Darwinistic of a world. And we're doing them the favor of bringing things progressive to them. And then on account of their inferiority, right, we claimed it was nature and nurture. We contended, right, that the Malaysian part of them was inferior. Because remember, at this time, right, you had not only macro species evolution was taught as if it were the gospel truth, but along with that was the genuine belief that different, quote, races had likely evolved from a different ancestor, so that they're somehow literally less human, less evolved, etc. And of course, there's no science to that whatsoever now, but supposedly that was adhered to back then. So they felt like they were biologically inferior, and that also they were culturally and historically inferior, because since the 1500s, they had been colonized by Spain, and we had determined that Spain was a backward civilization, especially for a European one. All right. So they needed years of tutelage. And these two gentlemen, E. Spencer Pratt and Commodore Dewey, gave their word to Emilio Aguinaldo that we would not stay in the Philippines and wanted nothing as far as infringing upon their autonomy, but neither of the two would put it in writing. And of course, it ended up not being true as we stayed there. All right. Well, number 4, the negative historiography continues. This is under the assumption, right, that not only did the U.S. act for its own self-interest, because remember, if you believe in geopolitics, right, you're doing it on behalf of your entire people and population, right? So once again, with geopolitics, you divide the map up as if it were like a chessboard, okay? And you look at your most they call it contingency, right? The what ifs. When you deal with contingency, you look at your most likely imminent threat in the future. And like I said, with us, I think arguably I would say that they contended it was Germany and Germany's quick rise after its solidification in 1870 and England. All right. And so what you do is you look at certain geographically pivotal areas on the map in our backyard, in the Pacific, our front porch, in the Caribbean. And you do not take no for an answer with those areas to allow your Navy to keep some of its ships there, to allow polling stations, kind of like the AM PMs of the day, to fuel up your ships, and so forth, right? And so we took it a step. They take it a step further with this historiography here. Is they contend that the U.S. was not just acting in the name of geopolitics, but was acting on behalf of big business, right? And technically, what a lot of people would call that is a plutocracy, right? Rule by a kind of tyrannical government that's in the pockets of and in cahoots with big business. All right. So you see, we sent ambassadors to East Asia, and they threatened, they bribed, etc., to try to gain access to Asian markets. So the Unsan mines, where they found gold in Korea, we jumped on that. Remember, as early as 1854, we forcefully opened up Japan to trade with us by force with our Navy, and that was still going on. And then in China, right, it was the Canton province that the English and others had muscled themselves into with the whole opium trade and all that. And we wanted the status of whoever had the most lucrative and generous economic offers. We wanted the same as that country. And it happened to be England, and it's called most favored nation status. And we fought to have most favored nation status with China, whether they wanted us to have that or not. So they had a Boxer Rebellion, right, against not only their corrupt government, but because their government was selling out to the West. And so it was also, in a way, a rebellion against the West. And we sent troops to squash it. So this is a domestic dispute in China, and we're sending soldiers there to fight Chinese rebels. Supposedly the boxer part, they look like boxers because of the karate that they employed in fighting. Let's see here. Then we tried to throw our weight around in Haiti. The Haitian government, Legitime, I don't know how to say that in French, but at any rate, he would not afford the opportunities for us to keep our Navy there, to have most favored nation status, to help run their foreign budget. We asked a lot. The list, I remember, was pretty long. And when they said no, we armed Hippolyte and helped him win a coup. And then he turned his back on us and didn't offer it to us as well, that list of concessions. And so we threatened to invade Haiti. And France, Germany, and England ganged up on us and told us we better not. So we're playing like the villain in that narrative. All right. By the way, with the history writing, you could find a guy named Walter Lefebvre. Walter Lefebvre's books are very revisionist, very cynical of us, implying that we did have somewhat of a plutocracy. So if you're interested, Walter Lefebvre is the guy to look for on that topic. It's a little old now by now. A lot of his writings were in the 90s and right at the turn of the millennium, but they still are just very factually rich with data after data supporting us being for big business and for our own interest at the expense of these other countries. All right. Then you have from the mid to the late 1800s a series of American pirates who went throughout Latin America and tried to rule directly or indirectly. And we called them filibusters. And no, that's not the same as filibustering in Congress, right? But with the filibusters, William Walker, supposedly, I've never read a biography just on him, but William Walker virtually took over Nicaragua. Samuel Zamuri was called the Banana Man, and he owned most of the fertile land in Honduras. All right. United Fruit Company owned most of the land in Nicaragua. And then what made it worse, right? Like in Nicaragua, is you had one Somoza family member after another ruling, and they were getting rich off of United Fruit Company. They were giving kickbacks to the leader. So he would offer them these lucrative land deals. They'd buy up most of the fertile land at the expense of the Nicaraguan peasants. And then they would pay back that corrupt leader. And they would also even go so far as to protect him. And I don't just mean the businessmen. They would use their connections in government to get the U.S. to help send arms to them because he's friendly to American government. So for quite some time, right, we would send, we would train Latin American right-wing dictators' armies in the Panamanian Canal Zone, and then send them back to their country to keep their oligarchic rule, held firmly because they were friendly to U.S. Corporations. All right. And so, yeah, some of these places, that's where you get the term Banana Republic for Honduras. And yeah, it's just kind of a sad story. And later on, this is going to be exacerbated during the Cold War because the idea was, right, is we had a president, I can't recall which one, but he was mentioning Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, and he was quite a right-wing dictator. And he said, yes, he's a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. And that was pretty telling. All right, because he was anti-communist and he was friendly to American corporations. And then gunboat diplomacy. This is the very thing that we would not we would not tolerate from the European countries, but we could do it, just not them, right? Do as I say, not as I do. And so at any rate, with gunboat diplomacy, especially if someone later on was connected to the Federal Reserve System as a bank and a lender or creditor, and they lent money to Haiti, Dominican Republic, some small Latin American country, and they defaulted on their loans, the U.S. Navy would come in, take over their major port cities, take over the customs offices, take the revenue that was owed to these banks themselves. And in one case, I kid you not, like in Haiti, we ended up insisting that we run their budget until they paid back American lenders. And then, of course, the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, the Panama area did not exist as an independent country yet. It belonged to Colombia. Colombian government would not grant an American corporation the opportunity to build a trans-Isthmian canal. And I guess an isthmus is a narrow strip of land that's connected by two different larger pieces of land. But at any rate, there's one in Nicaragua, and there's an isthmus, of course, that we utilized in Panama. So at any rate, what did we do? Is while we were in negotiations with Colombia, there was a Panamanian rebellion, and we helped militarily put it down. But then when Colombia said no to us, right, Then we switched and we armed and assisted the Panamanian people in fighting for their independence. And I kid you not, there was one particular region where they had American corporate land, and the Colombian soldiers came in there, right near a railroad, and we sent troops there, and we told them we are protecting this corporation's property, and you might fire a gun that happens to go in our general area and kill one of the corporate workers. So therefore, you can't fight here in this region. And of course, the rebel army took advantage of that. So the first line of business, right, when the Panamanians win their independence, is to grant us a 10-mile width strip of land through Panama to build this canal. And yes, the canal had already been begun by Ferdinand Lesseps and his French company, and they went bankrupt and they quit, and we finished it from there. And I used to know, I don't know if I have it in here, how many casualties there were to that canal. There were a lot, most of them through malaria, because it wasn't until not well into, but the first decade of the 1900s, toward the end of it, I want to say around 1908 or so, where the scientists finally got on to the fact that the mosquitoes were carrying the malaria. And so at any rate, we established the canal zone. We claim that we are leasing it for 99 years. And then when you do your later U.S. history, the administration of Jimmy Carter is going to give it back. They're going to move to give it back, and Bill Clinton will help try to finalize that. As a matter of fact, Jimmy Carter tried, but he failed. Let's see here. Filipino elites like Cayetano Arellano wrote that Filipinos could embrace and serve America as a mother with a debt of gratitude as long as America fulfilled her obligations. To elites like Emilio Jacinto, Felipe Buencamino, and Apolinario Mabini, the definition of liberty that sufficed for Filipinos entailed a relationship of reciprocity between the governors and the governed. The governed would offer love and esteem for the governors, provided that the latter ruled by, quote, reason, razón, and looked for the bienestar, for the well-being of their people. And I'm making the argument here that they did not do such. And by the way, there's another book that's right to the point, and it's called Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, Kinzer. And he goes over one instance after another of us overthrowing a foreign government. I don't really have the time to get into it, but if you look into it, revisionist history also really makes a lot of sense going through the data of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands as well, the Haole, the white Americans that got involved there. They arguably started off in the 1820s as Methodist missionaries, but as early as the second generation were not too interested in the things of God. They established the well-known sugar companies and corporations. And then with Kamehameha III, he privatized land and allowed the highest bidders to buy up unlimited amount of land, and the Haole started buying up the majority of it. And then they had what was known as the Bayonet Constitution, whereby they forced themselves upon the leading chief of the Hawaiian Islands and made a republic on paper. But the property requirements to be a citizen were so high that it was kind of a sham. And also they made the non-elected cabinet members extremely too powerful to the Hawaiian leader. So much so that he was seen as a puppet. And then oh gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. I want to say the person that did the Bayonet Constitution was Kalakaua. And then oh gosh, I'm thinking of her. I've read a book on her, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the darn woman who took a stand against us. But it's a sad, tragic story. Liliuokalani. and she's going to fail, sadly. She's going to refuse to allow her people, her army, to be used against these American um, rebels under a guy named Lorne Thurston. Right. And so the American Marines are going to come in to protect Americans, ostensibly. And Lorne Thurston and the other Howley are going to form an independent republic. And it takes about 5, 6 years. And there'll be talk of annexing the Hawaiian Islands as a state. Of course, that took a while to happen. Let's see here. So yeah, so this is basically the idea, right? Is that again, the American government was always looking out for the interest of big business and kind of bullying big businesses opportunities to open up throughout the rest of the world, especially in quote underdeveloped countries that could do nothing about it militarily. Look at Manuel Quezon, his complaint here. It is the firm belief of the Filipinos that the ownership of large tracts of land by foreigners constitutes a menace to the independence, both political and economical, of the archipelago. All right. Yeah, that's just my notes. So anyway, on this, right, court history says that because of the dangerous beliefs that were percolating in the 1890s, we believed as a nation that it was vital for us to get more aggressive and to engage in geopolitics, right, for our own survival. The whole white man's burden, that if we do happen to colonize someone in the name of our best interest and protection for us in the future, that they will be better off for it because of the advantages that we brought with us. Okay. And court history also contends that our two presidents in a row, Grover Cleveland, who refused to get involved, and McKinley, was supposedly dragged kicking and screaming into the Spanish-American War. So if you're going to be the bully, right, you depict yourself as the quiet guy in the bar in the corner who was trying to mind his own business and did not want to have to fight. And then revisionist history says, right, that, it was convenient. You had the Secretary of State Gresham, who said that we were on the verge of a class war with the poor, especially when the Pullman strike happened in 1894. We had a Great Depression in 1893, and we had a surplus of goods and no markets to dump them into. Okay. And so this could be a pleasant, splendid little war, as they called it, with few casualties, and win over lands in quick succession, and be able to trade and dump our surplus products there, and be able to have geopolitical spots that in the future, if we're ever threatened by a real menace like Germany or England, we're prepared for it. All right. And also as a nice little distraction from our depression and from our class warfare that was going on arguably in the 1890s. All right. Cynthia Mendoza, thank you for being here, hon. I thought I was talking to myself, to be honest.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I got here a little late, but I was like, I need to go on.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for all your info.
All right. And so yeah, so I hope that you got here in time to feel like you got a pretty good the kind of the gist of things.
Yeah, I got here around 4:30. So I was doing other homework at my work, and I
Sure.
realized it was Tuesday and 4 o'clock. So I came home really fast to log
Well,
on.
good for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Of course.
All right. And so you'll get extra credit not only on the Gilded Age, but also on imperialism, okay?
Thank you. Yeah, I was also on the Gilded one last week. I try not to miss, but
No, I understand.
sometimes it happens.
Yeah, I tell you what, chronologically, I think of my education being split in two. First half of my education did not entail employment.
Hmm.
And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm proud of the way that I didn't I utilized the way I utilized my time. I studied a lot
Okay.
and so forth. But I didn't have to work.
Oh,
And then as time went on, I had to get a full-time job, and boy, that makes all the difference in the world. It really
yeah,
does.
it does make a really big difference. I came back to school last year. I'm 26 now, but I went
Mhm.
to school from 17 to like 20. But I just went back to school last year, so
Good
it's
for
kind of
you.
new for me and it's a new experience. I back then, I mean, I also worked, but I feel
Mhm.
like I'm a lot more busier right now.
I bet.
And yeah, it shows sometimes, but school is definitely important. So
Good. No, I want to be able to promise you that it'll pay off. It
yeah,
will.
yeah.
It
Then
will.
also, I remember I invited you for our folklorico dances,
Oh,
and
really?
my school is actually gonna have well, the school I work at. I
Sure.
don't know if you'll be able to make it. I will send you an email, but we are having a performance
Sure.
on Friday, this Friday, from 1 to 4 o'clock. Our dances are gonna be from 2:30 to 3:30, I believe. Um, I feel like you will enjoy it because our theme is Dia de los Muertos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna have altares, we're gonna have a lot of culture. I am a pastry chef also, so I'm gonna be selling cupcakes.
All
Um,
right.
if you are, I will send you the information as well as the address and everything.
Okay.
In case you wanna come on by.
I
Um,
would
I
love that.
I will send you my yeah, I will send you my information as well. That way I can lead you the way whenever if you do make it.
Okay.
I
Thank you so much.
I hope yeah, I we are in Acampo, California though. Lodi around
Okay.
there.
Sure.
So I don't know how far out you are.
That's not too bad. That's not too
Yeah,
bad at all.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that'd be very exciting. I hope you'll be able to make it and see what we have to offer there.
As do I. Yeah, I've read of the Ballet Folklorico for so long, and I've
And
intended to watch one of their performances for so long. And
wow.
this would be my first time.
Well, this is these are little ones. We're teaching little ones. So we
Oh,
have from as young as third grade to middle school.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
But
that's
it's
even
very
better.
fun. Yeah. But yeah, I would definitely love for you to see all everything that theme of our culture, Dia de los Muertos. So I feel like it's gonna be pretty fascinating for you.
For sure. For sure.
Mm.
Well, thank you so
Alrighty.
much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope to see you there.
Awesome.
So this Friday, I have it written down, and I will definitely I'll tend to my email and find
Awesome.
out the
Yes, I will
specifics.
email you. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. All right,
Bye.
have a
Have a
good
good
day,
one.
okay?
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.